Take a look now, if you will, at 2 Corinthians. Today is a great look. It's a great look at just the passage of this whole thing. The title today is Things to Come, right? Things to Come. And we're actually going to be looking at a passage that has to do with things to come that is in the lives of believers. This is not so much Revelation type, great white throne judgment and judge and everything, things like that. But this has to do with those who are his. Why? Because Paul is talking here to believers and he's really trying to encourage them. I don't have a whole lot of background material to share with you other than just this thought that this whole book of 2 Corinthians is Paul trying to encourage these believers at Corinth, right? After they'd really messed up. And so a lot of this is just that picture. So I've taken chapter 5 and I've kind of cut it in half. Next week, okay, we're going to be talking, if you have people in your life who aren't believers, or if you're here today and you're not sure if you're a believer, next week it's going to be real clear, right? Just what the scripture teaches, not what denominations say, not what everybody else says, but what does the scripture say that it means to be a believer, as far as who Christ is, what he came to do. That'll be next week. And all of this is packaged in this chapter. Now, the only thing you need to know from last week, because we've been walking through 1 Corinthians, and you're going to really see how that all plays together with 1 and 2 Corinthians, because it's one big thought, right? Trying to help these Corinthians to grow, right? First of all, it was a lot of correction. Now it's encouragement. So as you take a look at this passage, the only thing from last week you need to know is that example, that metaphor, whatever you want to call it, that Paul used when he says that it's a treasure in jars of clay, right? And what does he mean by a treasure in a jar of clay? Well, a jar of clay is not real expensive, right? And but the treasure is what's inside. So the jar of clay is us. And so then what lives within us is what he's talking about. That's really all you need to know from last week. And when we head into this week, you'll see him continue that metaphor on, and it really is pretty neat. All right, so to basically look to a little toward end times. Let's number one, if you want to follow along with us. Number one is our temporary dwelling. Our temporary dwelling. And again, just listen to what he says here. So we're going to go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and pick up just a little bit of what we did last week, all right? And let's take a look now, if you will, in verse 16. It says this, all right? So we do not lose heart. Now, what does that mean? That means we don't get discouraged. All right, and here's what he says. Listen to this. He says, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. Now, what does it mean by temporary? What do I mean by temporary dwelling? We're talking about these bodies these jars of clay, if you will, right? We're talking about these. This is it's temporary. It is degrading, right? And we talked about this last week. Because it's temporary. This is what he's talking about, what it's going to look like. And you'll see it in just a minute when he goes to the more permanent one, right? He says, we don't lose heart. Therefore, you and I, we don't get discouraged, right? Why? Because there's something different. We're not counting on these things. Even though we're kind of going downhill, if you will, right? All right? Our outer self is wasting away. Our inner self is being renewed day by day. Therefore, that which is the outside is temporary. But that inside, that treasure here, now you're seeing it, that treasure inside the jar of clay. The treasure is what is enduring. The treasure inside is what is the most valuable, obviously, as opposed to the jar of clay that it's in. So the outer part, in reality, is not so much who you are, it's that which is within, right? So we don't lose heart. Why? Because our whole life is not about our exterior dwelling, right? This is what he's trying to, this is what he's, I just want you to see it. Because I've told you, as this passage is, I just want you to see and understand. I just want you again, because when you see it and understand it, it's like, oh, that is what that says. Right, here we go. So the outer self's waiting, but the inner is being renewed day by day. And look at the light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. We talked about that last week, all right? As we look to the things that are seen, but as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. Now, the critics, right, they like to say that faith is just an imagination, right? You just imagine something and then you believe it. But in reality, that's nothing further from the truth. In fact, we live in a world that they say seeing is believing. But just so you know where I'm gonna kind of go next week, when I start off next week, I'm gonna start with what I'm talking to you about right now, just to kick it off. But I want you to see it now first because of this passage, right? Do you realize seeing is believing? Okay, yeah. But think about this. Everything that you can see is temporary, right? Everything you can see is temporary. Therefore, it doesn't last long term. Why? Because of everything, of the way our world is set up, right? So what he's saying is, don't put your hope in the things that are temporary. Put your hope in the things that are more permanent. This is what he's saying by this, you know? So what does that mean, temporary? Well, think about everything, right? Think about the new car that you buy, you know? As soon as you buy it, right? It's just premature junk, right? Brand new car, premature, and you have to work like the dickens to keep it from degrading too fast. But it's like everything, guys. Everything in this world is temporary. Everything in this world, it may last a little longer than most, but that determines something's value. Number one, how much does it cost? And number two, how long will it last? But everything you and I know is temporary. But listen, this is what I'm going to start with next week. And this is something you have to understand to get this passage. You were made for more. You see, the things that you desire, long for, want in this life, even if you're not a believer, right? These are true for all of us. Right? The thing that you long for is for something permanent, something eternal, something long-lasting. But see, what happens is most people in this life, they put all their eggs in the basket of the temporary, and they're devastated when they go downhill. Am I making sense? Or they just lose interest and they throw it away and they go on to something else, right? Why? Because there's nothing that you can see that is long lasting. And yet the scripture, the Bible tells us that God has put eternity into our hearts. Therefore, you and I can think future. You and I do think future. We think long term. And we get discouraged. This is why it says we don't lose heart. We get discouraged. We get, if you will, even downtrodden when things begin to go downhill. And everything, in fact, what is it? The second law, I believe it is. This may be a little too eggheady for you, but the second law of thermodynamics, right? Entropy, right? Everything unravels, right? Everything is going down, right? Interesting, huh? Everything is that way. Everything we know is. So that is why when people put their whole lives into the temporary, they can become either devastated or very cynical as they grow, because you can't ever find anything, right? You can't find anything that's long lasting, and yet it's what you long for because it's the way you were created. And if you were created for the long term, to look to the future, the long time future, then it makes sense that nothing ever is content. We're not ever content. You know, it's an amazing thing how that works. You know, when it's what we long for the most, it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how much you might succeed or don't succeed. It doesn't matter so much what you have or what you don't have. I will tell you this, that whatever you do have, you won't be content with it when you have it. Right? I remember before I came to you, I spent several years spending time with, you know, doing chapels and doing some of the things with the Bucks and other visiting teams, the NFL that would come into town. And I did that a whole lot before I came to you. And I spent a lot of time with those guys, you know. And some of these guys have reached the pinnacle of athletic careers, right? In fact, there was that one year, it was pretty cool, pretty fun year, you know, when the Bucks won the Super Bowl. But you know, you wouldn't believe the contentment level, how quickly that faded away with those guys. Am I making sense? You think, boy, oh man, you're there. That's all you could ever want. Not really. Not really. You wouldn't believe how quickly that faded away with some of them. I used to tell them, I think that's why I loved going, because I would go and some of the athletes, I would tell them, hey, listen, hey guys, who you are, your self-worth has nothing to do with how well you catch a ball. I mean, think about it. How dumb is that? But you talking about temporary, guys. Athletics is temporary with a capital T. I grew up playing a sport, and I put everything into it. It became God little G for me, right? And after 3 surgeries, I couldn't play anymore. And you talking about hitting the bottom. Guys, we were made for more. That's why we become dissatisfied with the things. All right, marriages. Listen, I don't have as much time as I used to. But I used to do a whole lot trying to help marriages, you know, grow. And some of the greatest marriages I have been around are when neither of the couple, husband and wife, are counting on each other to come through for them. Because let me tell you something, when we get married, we have this thought that, well, we found this one person who's gonna meet my every need. Oh, Lord help you. Right? Because listen to me, there's not a person alive who can meet your deepest needs. I don't care if they try hard. Because when it's all focused on you, you know what happens to you? You become this big hole of need, and it just keeps getting bigger, and nobody has what it takes to fill that. You see, because you were created for more. Am I making sense? So therefore, the happiest couples I've ever come into contact with are those who obviously have a relationship with the Lord. They get their needs met by Him, and they're free to have a great relationship with each other, right? Not putting expectations on this person, right, to come through or to be this or to be that. Am I making sense to you? So there's this is what we're talking about with this. This treasure in a jar of clay is something you long for. It is something that you were created for, that nothing temporary can fill it, right? This is what he means he says that the things are seen are transient. What's the word transient mean? Temporary. So that what you see is temporary. So we go running after certain thrills and feel-goods and temporary fixes, and in reality, it's a good fix for a while, but like everything, the fix lasts shorter and shorter before we throw it away and go find another fix, right? Whatever it might be. It is what it is. It's what makes this such a powerful message, right? For the things that are seen are transient, temporary, but the things that are unseen are eternal. So, and therefore, what you long for the most doesn't exist in what you can see. Isn't that crazy to think about? This is what he's talking about. But you have to think a little bit to understand what he's talking about, right? Right? So this is how that the Corinthians have matured a little bit, because Paul's talking to them about a little more deeper stuff, right? So number one, then, our temporary dwelling. Number two is our permanent dwelling. And he just kind of gives you a look at what that looks like. He says, for we know that if the tent, all right, Paul was a tent maker, right? And that was what most people at the time lived in, right? Permanent dwellings, that is, brick or stone, those were expensive. Only the most wealthy could have those, right? Here we go. For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed. So what's he talking about? He's talking about this body, right? The jar, treasures in jars of clay. So we know that if the tent, that is this outward body, which is our earthly home, is destroyed. That is, it dies or it degrades or whatever happens to it. We have a building from God, right? A house not made with hands, but eternal in the heavens. So what he's saying here is, don't put all your eggs in the basket of even that. Now, don't get me wrong. I think you ought to take care of this earthly tent as much as you can. But I think you ought to eat well, and I think you ought to exercise, all those things, But in reality, you're fighting a losing battle. Aren't you glad you came today? Therefore, don't put all your eggs in that basket, right? Don't put all your eggs in that basket. You will be disappointed and you will be frustrated, right? He says, we know that's, nobody likes to talk about. We know that's where it is. But those that are his, we have something that's on its way. People, some of the old gospel songs and different things talk about mansions and glory and all that. But in reality, the structure that's being talked about as far as heaven goes is not so much a physical structure, it's the new home, right? You see what he's saying? It's the new home. Lord, bring on the new home, right? Interesting. All right, it's eternal. It's something you long for, something that's permanent. I just want something that lasts, is the cry of most people today, right? Chapter 5, verse 2, it says, for in this tent we groan. I got up groaning this morning, if you know what I'm talking about, right? There's always something that hurts different than it did yesterday, right? Because, but that's what happens, right? Unless you're young, you'll get there. Again, aren't you glad you came? But this is real stuff. If you want real stuff, this is as real as it gets. This is what he's talking about, right? We groan. Why? Because we're longing for something else. Those that are his, those who have the treasure inside, know the inside part, and they're ready for the outside to match the inside. All right? That's the groan. In fact, Paul uses that word groan in Romans. He says that the creation actually groans. Therefore, to be liberated from, here we go, from its being subject to decay, right? That is temporary, entropy. That is winding down. Starts good, and there's a birth, but then it goes downhill from there kind of thing, right? So in this tent we groan, therefore we long, it says here, to put on the heavenly dwelling. And that's not some mansion or a house in heaven, that's you, right? But who you are is what the most important. This is just the house. You hear that language when people talk about it. This is where they get it from, all right? If indeed by putting it on, we may not be found naked, all right? So he's just using that clothing analogy as opposed to the tent analogy. And he's saying, hey, listen, is that they happen in concert with one another. He goes on to explain, for while we are still in this tent, that is this body, we groan being burdened. Well, this life is burdensome, comes the picture. Not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed. So he talks about death as being taking off the old clothes and in reality putting on new. This is what he's saying, right? So that what is mortal, temporary, is swallowed up in life. So now these figurative type phrases make sense in what he's talking about when you understand clothing and tent and what he's referring to, right? This is for those that are his. Because when you think about it, what is that treasure inside jars of clay? It's the gospel. It's what we talk about. It's what we're going to talk about next week. Who Christ is and what he came to do. It's that difference that's made in us, right? And so you have then this picture of what's to come. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God. Therefore, it is his work, right? Who has given us his Spirit as a guarantee. Other places in the scriptures it talks about it's a deposit, however you want to call it, but it's that which is not what it is, but what it's going to be. And that treasure inside, if you will, a jar of clay is his Spirit inside, right? So we're always of good courage. Because here's what we know. It's like I always tell you. If you have an answer to death, you don't have a whole lot of problems. You groan a little, but you don't have a whole lot of problems because if you have that answer ahead, therefore, when this tent starts to go downhill, you don't have to freak out. And by the way, your tent's going downhill, right? But you don't have to freak out, right? Because it's what you're looking forward to, that which is permanent. And we long for it, guys. We long for something that lasts, right? That's how we were made. That's how we were created, right? We know that while we are at home in the body, we're away from the Lord. So there's a separation between the two, right? But this is where you get the phrases like going home, right? I'm going home. And the more, if you are a believer here today, if you are truly his, new creation, we're going to talk about that next week, then the more you grow in him, and the older you get, not so much age, but the older you get in him, the more you long for going home, the less that this, trying to hang on to grasp every last thing you can, right, for the time you have left. It's kind of a sad way to live, because that just is what it is, right? Right? But when you have him, then that becomes the picture of having that taken care of. I don't know, it's just incredible. Let's continue reading. So we know that we're at home in the body, we're away from the Lord. For we don't walk. What does that mean? We don't live. For we live by or walk by faith, not by sight. People laugh at this, but I want you to think about not by sight. All right? How is it, if you're not a believer, this is just stuff I like you to think about. How's it working out? Right? Oh, you people make this stuff up and you say, just have to have faith, as if faith makes it real. Faith makes nothing real, right? If it's not real, then faith doesn't do anything to it. But remember this, we've already talked about sight. That is, everything around you is temporary. So we can spend our lives trying to fill our lives with the things that are temporary that will never really come through for us, right? This is what he means. Not just believing, but walking, living, right? Living by faith versus living by sight. All right, good. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. Remember this, that phrase is for those who have walked with the Lord for a good while, right? Let me tell you what, when you learn, that's the way Paul got. Remember, he just said, listen, I'm ready to leave. It is time to go home, right? It's kind of like me when I go overseas, mission trips and things, because wherever I go, I'm about a foot taller than most everybody where I go. And anytime I sleep in a bed, okay, my middle of my calf hangs over the end of the bed, right? And it's always hot where I go. I don't know why. The DJ, you need to send me someplace that's colder, all right? Because I'm tired of the heat. Thailand and Peru and North Africa. And so I can't tell you, by the time I'm there, it's wonderful. we're teaching pastors and everything. But there comes a time after a couple of weeks, it's like, I'm just ready to go home, right? And that's here. But as you grow in your relationship with him, will begin to be a longing of going home. This is why you hear at services sometimes, at memorial services, homegoing, people say things like that. A lot of times people don't even understand what they mean, but a lot of it comes from here, from this passage, right? So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. So this is motivation. So guys, what does it mean? What are some of the proofs that we have in our lives that we are his? Well, one of the biggest ones is that you have a desire to please him. You may not do it very well at first, right? But that's what you want to do, right? If you have no desire, then you're probably not his. I don't care how religious you are, right? Because being religious is not what makes us his, right? So then we have these desires if we have that treasure that lives in us. So the desire to please him. Again, we may not do it very well at first, but it is a direction. All right, now, so then number 3, and this is where I'll be done, but this will take me a few minutes because I want you to understand. Our day of accountability. Now, a lot of people, I've had several people come through the reception and tell me, hey, Jeff, that really cleared that up because I didn't ever understand all that. Now, remember, okay, the scripture, let's just read the verse, all right? Verse 10, all right? For we must all, right? Now the we there is those who are believers, right? The Corinthians at that time, but this is all of us. So we, that is those of us who are believers, must all, my joke, I looked up all in the dictionary, right? It means all, right? So we have this, we must all what? Appear before the judgment seat of Christ. So what's he talking about? Right? So that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in this temporary dwelling, whether good or evil. What does that mean? All right, here we go. Well, first of all, let me tell you, the word evil there is not moral evil or sin like that we talk about. But that's not a great translation. Phallos is the Greek word. That word evil really means worthless. So what you're going to be held accountable for, let me tell you, by the way, if you're a believer here today, you will never be held accountable for any of your wrongs. That's what Jesus did at the cross, right? You're forgiven, and so Scripture says as far as the east is from the west. So you're not there for that because that's who Christ is, what he came to do. That's the treasure. So then what is this? Well, the Scriptures are real clear what this is, and I want to tell you about it, right? I want you to understand what this means. Because when you have this treasure in jars of clay and you have the different things, you and I, if we are his, we make it our aim to please him. That is, we want to be who he's called us to be. Therefore, we want to do the things that he's called us to do, if you're his. And so there will be a day of accountability. All right, and it's, again, judgment is our accountability. People get into those, they get all freaked out about those words, but in reality, it's just responsibility, right? It's whatever's been entrusted to you, have you used it, right? And one of the greatest ways you can ask yourself, have you used it to please him or please yourself? That's the greatest way to look at it. And when you're younger, obviously, you struggle with those things, and hopefully as you grow in your faith, it's not quite like that, but it'll make perfect sense in a minute. This judgment seat of Christ is mentioned in at least 2 other places. I wanted to show you the other one. Romans chapter 14, verse 10. Why do you pass judgment on your brother? So this is a different context that Paul is using it here. You see, you and I don't have the right to be judgmental, right? And I tell you what, believers can be real bad about that. That is not who he's called you to be. You are not to be the building inspector of other people. Especially it says here fellow believers, because that's what the word brother there means, sibling, right? He says, or why do you despise your brother, that is your fellow believer? For don't you know that we'll all stand before the judgment seat of God? So there it is again. As is written, the knee will bow, every tongue confess. In verse 12 it says, so that each one of us will give an accounting to God. Okay, so there's coming a time when we will when we will share what we have done with what's been entrusted to us. And this is just something you need to know. Now, let me tell you what this is not. We're going to take just a couple of seconds here because I want you to see this is where people get confused. Let me tell you what this judgment seat of Christ is not. It's not the Revelation one. Take a look at the Revelation chapter 20, verse 11. John said, I saw a great white throne judgment, right? He who was seated on it, and the presence of earth and the sky fled away from his presence, right? And no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and the books were open, books of life, different things like that. And everybody was judged according to what they'd done. You don't want to be judged according to what you've done, right? Because the scripture says we're all sinners, right? So that's the great white throne judgment. That's the end of the book of Revelation. That's the end. That is not what this is. This is for those who are his, right? That's why he said we all will be there. Just wanted you to see that, right? Now, as I close, right, I want you to see, well, then what is that, Jeff, and what's its purpose? Well, you see, in 1 Corinthians, he talked about it. That's the cool part about what we're doing. We're going through 1 and 2 Corinthians. So Paul doesn't take the time in 2 Corinthians to explain it all again because he explained it all in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. So you can turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and let's just look at it briefly. I got a few things I want you to see about this. And this is going to be a great springboard for where we're going next week. All right, here we go. This is what Paul said about this day, all right? He says, according to the grace God given me, this is Paul talking to them early on in the book of 1 Corinthians. He said, grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation and someone else is building on it. Now, laid a foundation, what's he talking about? Well, Paul said that his role was to share the gospel with people. That is who Christ is, what he came to do. And then what that is that's a foundation. Anyone who puts their faith and trust in Christ, there becomes a foundation in your life. That's all the metaphors you see in the scriptures that talk about, the rock of Jesus Christ, or two men went out to build, one built on sand, one built on rock, right? Christ is the rock. So it's the foundation on which you build. Now, verse 10 again, the other part says, let each one of us, that is those that are his, be careful how he builds on that foundation. Okay? There's nothing you can do to make yourself secure. That's what Christ did. But once you have a foundation that is secure, then what you build on top of that is your responsibility. Are you hearing what he's saying here? Be careful how you build. Not just how you build, but in reality, as he'll talk about in a minute, it's the materials you choose to build with. Interesting. He goes on to say in verse 11, for no one else can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Christ. So in case you didn't understand what he's talking about, he's giving you what the foundation is Christ. So there's nothing you can do about that one, right? Other than put your faith and trust in him. But after that, you become his, and then it becomes a responsibility. And then he tells you a little bit about what that means. All right, verse 12, he says, now if anyone builds, all right, on that foundation and he gives you 6 materials. We talked about this a few months ago, but I want you to see it again now in this big context of all of this. He says, if anyone builds on the foundation, now who is the one that's building? Those that are his, right? Those that are believers. All right, if anyone builds on that foundation, gold, silver, precious stones, and then you have wood, hay, and straw. You have 6 materials, but you have 2 types of materials. Listen, this is awesome. So look at this. What's this? All right. It's the same thing that he talked about, the temporary housing and the permanent housing. Because gold, silver, and precious stone are permanent. Wood, hay, and straw are temporary, right? And he used these illustrations because this was real common during their day. He says each one of us work, that is those who are his, will become manifest. The word manifest means to reveal, like the book of Revelation, or to expose, if you will, to show something that's been hidden. All right, for the day, right? This is what we're talking about, right? The judgment seat of Christ, right? And all of us are going to appear there. For the day, we'll disclose it. All right, once again, disclosed and word manifest and revealed are almost, they're about 3 synonyms, about the same word, all right? Because it will be revealed by fire. Well, in his example, metaphor, whatever, fire is a picture of judgment here, that is, if you will, or a test, a fire test, right? So the way it's revealed is you run fire over it, and if it's gold, silver, precious stones, the fires won't do much to it. But if it's wood, hay, or straw, fire destroys it, right? It just ends into a heap of ash. Worthless. So it'll be revealed good, not so much good or evil, but good or worthless, if you're understanding what he's saying here. So think about that. So we have this comparison between temporary versus permanent. And that the accountability that we have is to give an account. Did we spend our time on the temporary or the permanent? Because there's 3 major valuable things about you. Every one of you have differing amounts. You have time, that's the most valuable, right? Then you have talents, natural giftings. We all have different amounts. And then treasures like finances, things that we hold valuable, right? So how do you spend those things? That will determine if it's gold, silver, precious stones, or wood, hay, straw. Okay? If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he'll receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he'll suffer loss. But just in case you understand what he's talking about, yeah, he himself is secure, right? He himself will be saved, right? It's through the fire, but because the foundation's solid. So we're not talking about those who aren't believers, we're talking about those that are. So accountability, and that makes sense to me. Jesus talked about it often. Yeah. And I'm going to use an illustration I used before, but this will help you, all right? Please don't answer this out loud. All right, you will get it wrong. All right, prayer, gold or wood? Don't say anything. All right, well, prayer has to be gold. Not necessarily. Why? Because Jesus talked about the Pharisees and he said, you know, they love to stand up and make long-winded prayers to sound impressive, you know, for everyone. And Jesus said they have their reward. And what's their reward? Their reward is being thought well of by everybody, right? Interesting. Giving, right? See, guys, it's not that if you give, it's why. There's your phrase. Why? That's why you can't judge someone else, because you don't know the why. He does, but only 2 people know. God knows and you know yourself. You can't judge the why in somebody else's life. That's when we're talking about being judgmental, right? Therefore, that's why I always talk about it around here. I always talk about it around here. So much more important to be who you're supposed to be than to do what you're supposed to do, right? Because if you're doing something for the right reasons, even if you're doing the wrong thing, eventually you'll get it right. But if you're doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, you'll eventually quit doing the right thing. Does that make sense? Therefore, what makes something gold is why you do it. All right, let me give you an illustration. All right, I'll be done with this one. All right, here we go. And don't answer this out loud. All right. $10 million or 10,000? Don't say anything. Which would you rather have? Okay. Now, most of you, oh man. But if you've grown enough in your faith, then 10 million becomes a burden. You wanna know why? Because you're responsible for it. But most people think, oh, 10 million, they're thinking what? I can do what I want to do, buy what I want to buy, I don't have to work, and I can, that's why you probably don't have it, right? And that's definitely why he's not going to give it to you, right? But it's all about temporary stuff, right? See, you and I are to be different. What God has committed to you, you're accountable for. Spend it on the things that are permanent, not on the temporary things. That's what makes it gold, right? It's the why, not so much the what. Because guys, all of us in the room have different. But if you're a $10 million person in here, you have a lot more to be accountable for, right? Than the $10,000 person has, right? And then in reality, why does it matter if some person has 10 million, one have 10,000? Why? Because it's all about him anyway, right? I want to please him with the 10,000 I have. Believe it or not, it's a lot easier when you only have 10,000. All right? It gets burdensome when you have the other. Now, I'm not talking about just money here. You know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about your time. I'm talking about everything. What is it that we do? Therefore, we make it our aim to please him. Therefore, as we grow in our faith, we may not do it so well at the beginning, but we will grow into it. It's an incredible thing because we're going to give an account of ourselves. I find that interesting. I find that amazing for you and I to see, hear, and understand as he's trying to encourage these Corinthians. Hey, guys, all right, there's a lot of gifts and talents there, right? Let's grow. Let's learn to stop spending those things on ourselves. Because the problem is, the more self-centered we get, the bigger the hole gets, and it doesn't matter what you have. Then you wind up having all kinds of problems. I don't know, it's an amazing thing. When you really see what these passages are talking about. So he continues on next week. Next week talks about if anyone's in Christ, he is a new creation. Now you see the context. Guys, you don't have to be this way. You don't have to live this way. But if you're his, you're gonna want to, right? So many people bemoan, well, I have to. I wonder sometimes if they're even believers, if they're even his, right? Because in reality, this is who we want to be, not who we have to be. It's an amazing thing when you think about it. All right, next week, looking forward to finishing this up.